The night the storm hit, I watched the so-called smartest people in the neighborhood wade through waist-deep water, clutching their designer shoes and screaming for help right where I told them the flood would happen. My name's Kenneth Baker, and 3 months ago I warned the HOA that their little beautification project, the one led by Riley Thompson, our self-proclaimed real estate genius, was about to turn Maple Creek Estates into a disaster zone. I showed them the maps, the slope angles, the drainage flow. They laughed. They called me an idiot with a calculator. Well, when the rain came, it didn't care about votes or opinions. It only followed gravity. And it followed it straight into their living rooms. Before we get into how the entire neighborhood turned against me and how nature settled the score, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? And hey, if you've ever had an HOA ignore your warning, hit that subscribe button, because this story is the revenge of common sense. Maple Creek Estates was the kind of place real estate agents bragged about on glossy brochures, luxury living in harmony with nature, tree-lined streets, identical mailboxes, and artificial perfection in every corner. The grass was always the same shade of green, and if your roses didn't bloom on schedule, you could expect a polite but firm reminder from the HOA. I bought my home there after 20 years in civil engineering, designing bridges, drainage systems, and water management infrastructure across 3 states. I thought I was buying peace. What I didn't know was that I'd just moved into a war zone disguised as a homeowners association. The first few months were calm enough. I kept to myself, fixed up my garage, and enjoyed my quiet corner lot that backed up to a narrow, natural drainage channel, a small creek that carried runoff down toward the forest. To me, it was beautiful. To most of the neighbors, though, it was ugly and messy, and that's where Riley Thompson came in. Riley was the HOA president, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture, perfect hair, and an ego big enough to flood a town all by itself. She wasn't an engineer or a planner or even remotely technical. She was a former real estate agent who loved projects. And when Riley had a new idea, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. One sunny Saturday, I was trimming my hedges when Riley strolled up with a clipboard and her signature wide smile, the kind that looked friendly until you realized it was a warning. "Mr. Baker," she began using that tone, "HOA presidents reserved for children and rule breakers were starting a beautification plan for the neighborhood. The board voted unanimously. We're going to fill that little ditch behind your property and turn it into a walking path with decorative rocks and benches. Imagine how much nicer it'll look." I froze for a second, processing her words. "You're talking about the drainage channel," she chuckled. "Drainage, oh Kenneth, it's barely a trickle. It's more of an eyesore than anything. Once it's covered, we can finally landscape properly." I put down my trimmer, wiped my hands, and looked her in the eye. "That's not an eyesore, Mrs. Thompson. That's the primary storm runoff channel for half the neighborhood. You fill that in, and you'll have water backing up into homes during the first heavy rain." Riley gave a little laugh, the kind you give someone who just said something absurd. "I think we'll be fine, Kenneth. The board already consulted a landscaper." "A landscaper?" I repeated, stunned. "You need an engineer, not a landscaper. That's a natural drainage path, not a garden feature. It exists for a reason." She waved her hand dismissively. "You engineers always overcomplicate things. We'll make it pretty and practical." Trust me, I didn't trust her. That night I pulled out my old project maps and checked the county's drainage layout for Maple Creek. Sure enough, the channel behind my property wasn't just a random depression, it was a designated runoff line connected to underground culverts, leading all the way to the retention basin at the end of Pine Hill Drive. If they filled it, they'd be blocking the main artery of the neighborhood's stormwater system. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early with my laptop, a printed topography map, and a cup of black coffee. I'd need the caffeine. The meeting started like all HOA meetings, a few residents complaining about parking violations, one guy whining about Christmas lights being left up too long. Then Riley stood and unveiled her beautification plan. She had PowerPoint slides, stock photos of smooth stone paths, and little wooden bridges over manicured creeks. People oohed and ahed. Then she asked if anyone had concerns. I raised my hand. "Of course," she sighed, forcing a smile. "Yes, Kenneth. Before you fill in that channel," I said, plugging my laptop into the projector, "you need to see this." The screen lit up with a map of the neighborhood color-coded by elevation. "This," I continued, "is your entire drainage system. That ditch you're filling. It carries all runoff from the upper blocks of Maple Creek during storms. It's not optional. It's engineered to prevent flooding." Riley frowned. "We're not talking about a floodplain here, Kenneth. We're just talking about landscaping." "That is the floodplain," I replied. "You fill it, you'll flood half the houses on this side of the street." She let out an exaggerated sigh and looked around the room. Folks, do any of you remember the last time this neighborhood flooded anyone's silence? Exactly, she said, smiling smugly. Because it doesn't happen. Let's not panic over imaginary disasters. A few people chuckled. Someone muttered, "He's taking this too seriously." I could feel the heat rising in my neck, but I stayed calm. You don't build a drainage system for when it rains a little. You build it for when it rains a lot. That's how prevention works. Riley shook her head. You're entitled to your opinion, but the board's already voted. Construction starts next month. That was it. End of discussion. When I got home, I sat at my desk and opened a new folder on my computer, HOA drainage proof. Inside, I saved every email, every copy of meeting minutes, and photos of the drainage channel before the project. If they wouldn't listen, maybe one day they'd have to see. Over the next few weeks, I watched construction crews roll in. They dumped gravel, filled the channel, and covered it with decorative stones. They even installed a couple of wooden benches beside what used to be the natural stream. It looked nice in that fake suburban way, until you noticed the standing puddles already forming after small rains. A few neighbors started to whisper about it. You think Kenneth was right, one woman asked her husband while I was out mowing the lawn. He shrugged. Riley said it's fine. She knows what she's doing. I almost laughed. One evening I was watering my plants when Riley walked by. Again, clipboard in hand as usual. See, she said cheerfully, gesturing toward the new stone path. Isn't it beautiful? I nodded slightly. It's definitely something. She tilted her head. You still think it's going to flood? I looked at the sky, where dark clouds were already forming on the horizon. I don't think I said quietly. I know. That was early summer. By late August, the air grew heavy, and the news started buzzing with words like tropical depression and record rainfall expected. While Riley was organizing a community picnic to celebrate the new pathway, I was busy buying sandbags, testing my sump pump, and cleaning my drainage trench. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Because I knew exactly how this story was going to end, and deep down I think Riley did too. She just couldn't imagine nature ever proving her wrong. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. The beautification project had become the neighborhood's pride and joy. Everyone wanted to hear updates, offer compliments, or volunteer to plant flowers along the new stone path. Everyone except me. I sat near the back, arms crossed, laptop in my bag. I wasn't there to argue anymore. I was there to document. Riley Thompson stood at the front, dressed in a bright red blazer and armed with her usual charisma. I just want to thank everyone who helped make Maple Creek more beautiful than ever, she beamed. The walking path has added value to all our properties and given families a safe place to walk their dogs. Isn't that wonderful? The crowd clapped. Someone shouted, "Looks great, Riley." Another added, "Finally, no more muddy creek." She smiled graciously. Exactly. We're all about progress here. Then she glanced toward me. Even our resident engineer, Mr. Kenneth Baker, has to admit, it turned out nice, didn't it? All eyes turned to me. I kept my tone neutral. It looks nice, but looks and function aren't the same thing. The applause faltered slightly. Riley, sensing a challenge, clasped her hands dramatically. Oh, care to elaborate for everyone? I sighed quietly, then stood up. Fine, since you're asking. I opened my laptop, connecting it to the projector again. I've compared the county hydrology maps with our property survey. The area you filled in isn't just decorative, it's the only natural runoff channel in the entire lower subdivision. It handles an estimated 40% of stormwater from the upper streets during heavy rainfall. Someone muttered, "He's doing this again." I ignored them. By filling it with gravel and decorative stone, you've reduced the cross-sectional flow capacity by at least 70%. The water's going to find another route, and that route is through your homes. Riley let out a theatrical sigh, feigning patience. Kenneth, with all due respect, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is not a floodplain. You're making people nervous for no reason. It doesn't have to be a floodplain to flood, I said. All it takes is one heavy rain, one clogged drain, and nowhere for the water to go. She rolled her eyes. So you're saying a little rain will destroy our homes? No, I replied evenly. I'm saying physics doesn't care what the HOA votes on. The room went silent for a moment, and I could feel the tension rise. Then a tall man at the front, Riley's husband Rick, spoke up, his voice full of smugness. So what's your solution, Kenneth? Dig a trench through our backyards again, maybe make it look like a swamp. We didn't move here to live in a construction site. I turned to him. The solution was to not block the drainage system in the first place. Riley folded her arms. We're not here to debate hypothetical disasters. The board has already reviewed this with our landscaper. Landscaper, I repeated slowly, disbelief dripping from my tone. You're trusting a landscaper's opinion on hydrology. That did it. The crowd started whispering, annoyed now. Someone said, he's so negative. Another whispered, always trying to act smarter than everyone. Riley smiled, sweetly, victory in her eyes. Well, thank you for your input, Kenneth, but I think the board and the community are comfortable moving forward. She turned off my presentation mid-sentence and switched to the next slide, pictures of flowers and benches. The room erupted in polite applause again, like a trained audience following a cue. I sat down quietly, resisting the urge to argue further. You can't fight ignorance with logic when pride is louder. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors passed by me awkwardly. One, a younger guy named Mike, whispered, I don't know, man. You might be right. My backyard's been wetter lately. I nodded. Just keep an eye on it, and check your gutters. Then came Riley, smiling like a cat that just caught a mouse. Kenneth, she said, in that sugar-coated tone, you really need to relax. This is a community, not a construction site. You're stressing people out with your doomsday talk. Doomsday talk saves lives, I replied. Ignoring it ruins them. She laughed, a short, fake laugh that barely hid her irritation. You engineers think everything's a ticking time bomb. This is a neighborhood, not a dam. I met her gaze. Funny you say that, because you're about to find out the difference. She frowned, but before she could respond, someone called her name, and she strutted off heels, clicking like punctuation marks of arrogance. A week later, I was walking the path behind my house after a light rain. The decorative gravel was already shifting, small puddles forming where the water used to flow freely. I crouched down and traced a small trickle finding its way between the stones. It was like watching nature whisper, just wait. I started taking photos. Each time it rained, I documented the pooling water, the erosion, the soggy lawns downstream. One night after another small storm, I sent an email to the HOA board. Subject, your gent. Drainage pathway observations attached. Our photographs showing standing water and erosion in the new walking path. These are early indicators of flow obstruction. I strongly recommend restoring partial drainage clearance before the storm season begins. Best, Kenneth Baker. No response. 2 days later, Riley posted in the community Facebook group. Just a reminder, the new walking path is perfectly safe and functioning beautifully. Please ignore alarmist rumors. Let's stay positive, neighbors, I nearly laughed out loud. Alarmist rumors, she said, as if gravity was just gossip. That week, I went to the county's public works office. I showed them the maps and explained what the HOA had done. The clerk, an older man named Tom Lewis, frowned as he flipped through the paperwork. They didn't file a permit for drainage modification, he said. That's a violation. Exactly, I said. They disguised it as a landscaping project. Tom shook his head. I'll have to send an inspector, but they'll probably stall HOAs. Always think they're above the county. Send him anyway, I said. Before the rain season starts, when the inspector arrived a week later, Riley went into full performance mode. I happened to be trimming my hedge again when she led him behind the houses. Oh, this, she said with fake surprise. It's just a little beautification work. We didn't change anything important. The engineer homeowner over there likes to exaggerate. She smiled toward me, a sharp fake smile. The inspector seemed skeptical but polite. Well, I'll make a note. You'll need to submit a drainage compliance form. Riley nodded, pretending to agree, then later told everyone, see, the county said everything's fine. Of course, that was a lie. The report clearly said further review pending. By late summer, the ground was dry and hard again. The board hosted a barbecue to celebrate the completion of the project. People laughed, drank wine, and congratulated Riley on her leadership. I stayed home, sitting on my back porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. A faint breeze carried the scent of rain, the kind of smell you recognize after years on construction sites. It wasn't the start of a drizzle. It was the warning before a season. I poured myself a cup of coffee and muttered under my breath, they'll learn. Some people need numbers to understand. Some need evidence. But people like Riley, they need consequences. And when the first storm hit, I knew the consequences would speak louder than I ever could. For a few weeks, life in Maple Creek Estates looked like something out of a magazine spread. Every morning, joggers strolled along the new creek path. Children rode scooters, and Riley Thompson strutted around like she'd just redesigned Central Park. Her husband Rick even hung a little sign near the benches that read Thompson Trail, a vision of progress. Progress. That word made my teeth clench, because behind the progress the water no longer flowed. I could see it every time it rained, puddles forming faster lawns, staying soggy longer, and the faint smell of stagnation creeping into the air after every storm. The natural trickle that once drained into the lower basin now pooled and sat trapped beneath layers of rock and decorative stone. It was subtle at first, nothing catastrophic, just unnatural. And when nature stops moving, you know trouble's brewing. Most people didn't notice or didn't care. They were too busy taking pictures for the HOA Facebook group. Number Maple Creek Pride, they called it. I was the only one who saw the signs. It's a curse being the only person who knows how things are supposed to work, and watching everyone else blindly believe in aesthetics over physics. It was mid-August when I got my first uneasy alert, a tropical disturbance forming in the Gulf. The National Weather Service issued a preliminary watch, which most people ignored. I didn't. I checked rainfall projections, storm trajectories, and soil absorption data for the county. Everything pointed to one fact: we were about to be tested, and Maple Creek's drainage system wouldn't survive the test. That evening, I sent another email to the HOA board, this time labeled Urgent in red. Subject: predicted storm system. Immediate action required. The National Weather Service is predicting 8-12 inches of rainfall within 48 hours. The previously modified drainage channel behind lots 42-68 must be reopened immediately to prevent residential flooding. I strongly advise removing the decorative gravel and restoring at least a 2-foot trench before the storm hits. If ignored, property damage is inevitable. Kenneth Baker, no reply. I waited 1 day, 2, nothing. On the third morning, Riley finally responded, not by email, but with a post in the community group complete with emojis. Hey everyone, some folks are panicking about the upcoming rain. Don't worry, Maple Creek's new design is perfectly fine. Everything drains beautifully. I walked it myself yesterday. Remember to keep your spirits high and stay positive, Door. The comments rolled in. Thanks, Riley. You're the best, always keeping us calm. I wanted to scream. So instead, I prepared. I spent the next 2 days checking my pumps, cleaning gutters, stacking sandbags near the back gate. My trench, the one I'd maintained quietly for years, was clear and functional. I even set up a few waterproof cameras aimed at the filled-in path. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong, because I wanted evidence when nature proved me right. My neighbor Jared came over that afternoon, his young son tugging at his arm. Hey Ken, he said awkwardly, you think it's really gonna get bad? My wife's freaking out after seeing the Weather Channel. I nodded slowly. It's not the rain that's dangerous. It's where it goes when it can't drain. He frowned. You mean down the path? Used to be the path, I said. Now it's a bathtub. He gave a nervous chuckle. Riley says the landscaping will help absorb the water. Riley says a lot of things, I muttered. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. You think I should do anything? Move your car uphill, I said, and don't leave anything valuable in the basement. He didn't ask further, but the look in his eyes told me he believed me more than he wanted to admit. That night, the news stations buzzed nonstop. Tropical Storm Everett projected to bring record rainfall across 3 counties. The anchor said words like unprecedented flood advisory and potential infrastructure stress. I glanced out my window. The air was thick, the sky bruised gray. There's a kind of silence before a storm that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. Around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Riley. Riley, Kenneth, stop emailing the board about this. You're scaring residents. The storm will pass. Please be a team player. Me, it's not about fear, it's about readiness. You filled the only natural outlet. You need to clear it before midnight. Riley. This is harassment. I'll have to report this to the HOA legal committee if it continues. That was the last message I sent her. From then on, I let the sky do the talking. The first drops came the next morning, small, steady, almost gentle. By noon, the rain turned to sheets, and by evening it was a wall of water. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the storm water rush through my trench exactly as designed. The flow was fast, strong, clean, a beautiful sight to an engineer's eye. But further down where Riley's path began, the water had nowhere to go. By 7 p.m., it was pooling. By 9, it was a shallow lake. And by midnight, the water had started creeping across the lawns of the lower houses. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Mike, hey Ken, my backyard's flooding. What do I do? Jared Waters coming through the fence line. Is it supposed to do that? Karen, lot 63? Did you know about this? Riley said it's your trench causing overflow. I nearly laughed at that last one. Of course, Riley was already spinning it, blaming me. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight and stepped outside. The sound of rain pounding on rooftops was deafening. My boots splashed in ankle-deep water as I walked down the street. Flashlights flickered from windows. Panic was spreading faster than the water. When I reached the path, I saw it, the inevitable. A roaring current had formed behind the gravel embankment, pushing against the decorative rocks like a trapped river trying to break free. The benches Riley had installed were half submerged, their legs trembling with the force of the flow beneath. And in the middle of it all stood Riley herself, holding an umbrella soaked to the bone, shouting orders into her phone. Call the contractor, she screamed. Get the pumps. The drains aren't working. I approached slowly, water up to my knees. They're not working because you buried them, I said flatly. She turned face red, mascara running. This is your fault. You dug your stupid trench, and now it's redirecting water here. I pointed toward my property where water was flowing away safely downhill. My trench is doing its job. Yours doesn't exist anymore. She opened her mouth to argue, but right then, the gravel embankment gave way with a thunderous crack. A wave of muddy water surged over the path, sweeping away one of the benches and knocking Riley off balance. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm before she fell. For a second, she looked at me, eyes wide, shocked, almost childlike. Then she turned and saw the flood rolling toward her house. The perfect neighborhood she'd built was drowning before her eyes. By 2 a.m., the emergency sirens wailed. Police cars blocked the main entrance, and fire trucks roared in their red lights, cutting through the black rain. Dozens of homes were flooding, basements filled like bathtubs. People scrambled to higher ground. I helped carry Jared's son out of their house, the boy clinging to my neck. The look on Jared's face was pure disbelief. You were right, he whispered. You were right about everything. I didn't respond. I just kept moving. Because when water decides to reclaim what's hers, arguing is useless. And Maple Creek Estates was learning that lesson the hard way. By dawn, Maple Creek Estates looked like something out of a disaster movie. The manicured lawns were gone, replaced by swirling brown water and floating debris. The picket fences that once separated the perfect properties now bobbed in the current like broken matchsticks. I stood on my porch, soaked to the skin, my flashlight cutting through the misty rain. The wind howled, rattling the window frames, and thunder rolled so close it shook the ground. From where I stood, I could see half the neighborhood underwater, all the way from the Thompson residence down to the cul-de-sac. The irony was suffocating. For months I'd been warning them that water always takes the easiest path downhill. And now that path ran straight through their living rooms. I ran to check on my drainage trench. It was working like a dream, the current fast and powerful channeling runoff safely toward the retention basin. My property and the 2 neighboring lots who had listened to my advice remained dry. The rest of Maple Creek wasn't so lucky. As I turned back toward the street, I heard shouting over the storm. Help! Somebody help! It was Jared wading through waist-deep water, carrying his 7-year-old son in one arm and dragging a plastic storage bin with the other. The water reached his chest, and I could see his porch light flickering behind him, half submerged. Over here, I yelled, running to meet him. I grabbed his arm and helped pull the kid up onto my porch. Inside, I shouted. Dry off, Jared set the boy down, panting hard. The water came in through the back door like a wave, he said, gasping. Basement's gone. Everything. I nodded grimly. You're not the only one. Over his shoulder, I could see more neighbors stumbling out of their homes, clutching pets, boxes, whatever they could grab. The HOA's Thompson Trail, that so-called walking path, was now a violent stream churning with mud and debris. And in the middle of it all, Riley Thompson was standing in her driveway, waving a flashlight, screaming at her husband. Turn off the breaker, Rick. Turn it off before the water. Her voice was drowned out by another crack of thunder. I splashed through the current toward her house. You need to evacuate, I shouted. The foundation's taking water. She turned to me, her umbrella long gone, her hair plastered to her face. I called 911. They said they can't reach us yet. All the main roads are flooded. Of course they were. Because those same roads drained through the system she'd destroyed. Behind her, the water surged higher, swirling around her flower bed, swallowing the white picket fence. Her husband Rick was inside, desperately trying to unplug appliances. Leave it, I yelled. Electricity's not worth your life. He looked up, panic in his eyes, then nodded and followed Riley out the front door. The water was nearly up to her knees now. I led them toward the higher ground by my property where the runoff still moved cleanly away. Riley stumbled, grabbing my arm for balance. I don't understand, she said breathlessly. Why isn't your house flooding too? I stared at her. Because I didn't fill in the drainage, Riley. Her expression shifted, confusion, then realization, then something that almost looked like shame. But it didn't last long. We followed the landscaper's design. He said it would be fine. The landscaper doesn't control the rain, I said coldly. You do. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, pale and stunned, as if she was finally seeing what her beautification project had really done. By mid-morning, the rain hadn't stopped. Emergency vehicles surrounded the entrance of Maple Creek, unable to go further. The main road had collapsed under the pressure, creating a small waterfall where asphalt used to be. I stood beside a rescue truck, briefing the county engineers who had just arrived. One of them, a gray-haired man in a yellow raincoat, listened intently as I explained what happened. So they blocked the natural drainage, he asked. Yes, I said, pointing toward the flooded trail. They filled it with decorative gravel, completely sealed it off. I warned them 3 times, documented everything. He sighed. We've seen this before. They thought they were improving the view. Another engineer took notes. We'll need your records for the county report. Already printed, I said, handing over a folder wrapped in plastic. Emails, photos, timestamps, even the permit they falsified. The man gave me a grim smile. You're thorough, Mr. Baker. Habit, I said. Engineering leaves little room for ego. Behind us, Riley approached her clothes, soaked mascara streaked across her cheeks. You, she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You're the one who called the county, aren't you? I turned to her calmly. You mean the people who might save your neighborhood? Yeah, that was me. Her voice cracked with anger. You made us look like fools, I raised an eyebrow. No, Riley. You did that all by yourself. She opened her mouth to argue, but a sheriff walked up and interrupted. Ma'am, we're going to need you to move back. This area's not safe. I'm the HOA president, she shouted. You can't tell me. Before she could finish, a loud crash echoed from her direction. One of the decorative retaining walls she'd built behind her house collapsed under the weight of the water, sending a torrent surging through her backyard. She screamed, stumbling backward as mud and debris flooded through the opening. The sheriff grabbed her arm and pulled her to safety. She was shaking uncontrollably, now the same woman who had mocked me in public, now watching her legacy crumble before her eyes. By afternoon, local news crews had arrived, broadcasting live from the chaos. I stood off to the side as they interviewed residents knee-deep in water, their voices trembling with anger and disbelief. The HOA said the system was fine, one woman cried. They said it couldn't flood here. Another man shouted, we paid thousands in HOA fees for this mess. I could see the reporter's camera pan over the submerged path, the wooden benches, the half-buried Thompson Trail sign barely sticking out of the muddy water. It was poetic in a grim kind of way. When a journalist approached me, microphone in hand, she asked, Sir, I heard you predicted this. Can you tell us what happened? I hesitated, looking out over the devastation. I didn't predict it, I said quietly. I calculated it. There's a difference. She nodded, sensing the weight behind my words. And you warned the HOA 3 times, I said. They called me an alarmist, an idiot. The camera lingered on my face for a moment, then panned toward Riley, who was sitting on the curb wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at her destroyed property. That image would end up on the evening news, a perfect symbol of suburban arrogance meeting natural law. That night, the rain finally stopped. The water began to recede, but the damage was irreversible. Basements collapsed, cars were ruined, and the HOA's entire budget, nearly $400, 0 inches community funds, was gone, washed away with the gravel they'd dumped over the creek. I walked through the aftermath with a flashlight recording video for documentation. Fallen fences, warped siding, uprooted trees, all of it. At the end of the trail where the creek used to flow freely, I found one of the benches upside down, half buried in mud. The plaque still glimmered faintly under my beam, Thompson Trail, a vision of progress. I knelt down and whispered, You got your progress, Riley. When I returned home, my house stood dry and steady. My pumps had done their job. My trench still carried runoff cleanly to the basin. The lights flickered but never went out. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the flashing lights fade in the distance. Somewhere out there, people were still trying to salvage what they could, their furniture, their memories, their pride. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. Because I hadn't wanted to be right. I'd wanted them to listen before it was too late. And now every ripple of muddy water outside was whispering the same truth. You can silence a man. You can ignore a warning. But you can't stop the rain. The morning after the storm, Maple Creek Estates no longer looked like a neighborhood. It looked like a lake with rooftops. A light mist hung over the still water, carrying the sour smell of mud and gasoline. Abandoned cars sat half submerged at odd angles. Plastic patio chairs floated down the street like driftwood. Birds circled above the flooded cul-de-sac, confused by the sudden appearance of a new pond. And standing in the middle of it all was silence, that strange, heavy silence that only follows chaos. When the first rescue boat arrived, the deputy steering it asked if anyone inside was still stranded. I pointed toward the Thompson house, or what was left of it. The entire lower level was underwater. Only the top story remained visible, curtains flapping through shattered windows. She's in there, the deputy asked. She was, I said. She might have gone to higher ground, but she hasn't answered calls. He nodded and steered toward the house, shouting through a megaphone. County rescue, if anyone's inside, make yourself known. A faint cry came from the balcony. "Up here, please." Riley Thompson appeared drenched, trembling, clinging to the railing. Her once elegant blazer was plastered with mud, her hair tangled and dripping. Behind her stood Rick, her husband, holding their soggy golden retriever. The deputy guided the boat to the side of the house, and I waded closer through waist-deep water to help them down. Riley's eyes met mine for just a second, shame, fear, disbelief. Then she looked away quickly. When she climbed into the rescue boat, she whispered, "It's all gone, Kenneth." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." By noon, County Emergency Services had turned Maple Creek's community center into a makeshift shelter. Dozens of homeowners gathered there, wet, exhausted, and furious. The air buzzed with frustration, whispered accusations, and the occasional muffled sob. I sat near the back, sipping a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, when I heard Riley's voice rise near the front. "This isn't my fault," she cried. "The county should have had better infrastructure. The landscaper was supposed to handle drainage." He said everything was compliant. Her voice trembled not with humility but with desperation. She was still fighting for control, even while surrounded by the proof of her failure. A county engineer, clipboard in hand, responded patiently. "Ma'am, your HOA filed the beautification project under cosmetic modification, not structural drainage work. That's an unpermitted alteration. You didn't submit the necessary environmental review." Riley shook her head violently. "We had approval from—" "No, ma'am," the engineer interrupted. "You claimed you had approval. You don't." The room fell quiet. Another resident, Karen Morales, stood up, pointing angrily at Riley. "You told us everything was fine. You said Kenneth was fear-mongering." A chorus of agreement rippled through the crowd. "She ignored the warnings. She spent our HOA fees on this. She ruined our homes." Riley's face drained of color. "It wasn't like that," she stammered. "We all voted for it." "Because you lied," Karen shouted. "You told us the county signed off. You told us Kenneth was overreacting." Rick, sitting beside her, covered his face with his hands. "Enough, Riley," he muttered. "Just stop." But Riley couldn't stop. People like her don't know how. That evening, I walked the flooded streets with Tom Lewis, the county inspector who'd first warned me that the HOA hadn't filed proper permits. He was quiet, his boots splashing through the shallow water as we surveyed the wreckage. "You tried to warn them," he said softly. "You did everything right." "Doesn't feel like it," I admitted. "They still lost everything." Tom exhaled slowly. "Sometimes people have to drown in their own decisions before they believe in consequences." We stopped near what used to be the Thompson Trail. The wooden benches were gone. The gravel was washed away, replaced by deep gouges carved into the earth by violent runoff. The creek had returned, not the gentle one I remembered, but a raging scar cutting through the neighborhood. Nature had reclaimed what was hers. Tom crouched to examine the damage. "When the county files the report," he said, "it's going to name the HOA as responsible, and you're going to be listed as the primary complainant who provided documented warnings. That'll protect you legally." I nodded. "I didn't do it for protection." "I know," he said, standing up. "You did it because you care about doing things right. There's not many like you left." Later that night, I returned home to find a small crowd gathered in my driveway. A few neighbors, the ones whose homes had taken less damage, were there with flashlights and tear-streaked faces. "Ken," said Jared, his voice heavy, We just wanted to thank you." I frowned. "For what?" "For warning us," he said. "You were the only one who actually knew what you were talking about. We didn't listen." "We should have." Another neighbor, Susan, chimed in. "You saved our kids last night. You helped carry them out. I'll never forget that." Their gratitude caught me off guard. For months, I'd been the villain, the negative engineer, the alarmist. Now they looked at me like I was the only steady ground left in a drowning world. I gave them a tired smile. "Just promise me one thing," I said. "Next time someone tells you something's wrong, even if it's inconvenient, listen." They nodded silently. A week passed before the county formally declared Maple Creek Estates a disaster zone. Cleanup crews moved in draining water and hauling out debris. Insurance agents swarmed like vultures, clipboards in hand. Riley tried to act involved at first, but the county engineers quickly sidelined her. They didn't need a decor committee, they needed real leadership. The HOA board held an emergency meeting at the temporary shelter, this time chaired by the Vice President Daniel Lee. He cleared his throat and read from a printed document. "Effective immediately, the board has voted to remove Riley Thompson as president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association, citing gross negligence, financial misconduct, and falsification of official documentation." The room erupted, half applause, half shouting. Riley stood up, eyes blazing. "You can't do this. You don't understand the pressure I was under." But Daniel continued, ignoring her. "The county has also confirmed a civil penalty for unauthorized alteration of a natural drainage system, $175,000. Additional fines for environmental impact are pending. Riley's knees buckled slightly. That's impossible, she whispered. We don't have that kind of money. Daniel looked at her coldly. You spent most of the HOA's reserves on your project, remember? That evening, I walked past the Thompson property one last time. The water line stained the bricks up to the windows. The driveway was cracked, the garage filled with mud. The house looked abandoned, already hollow and defeated like its owner. I spotted Riley sitting on the curb staring into space. When she saw me, she stood slowly. They're saying it's all my fault, she said quietly. Even Rick's leaving. I've lost everything. I paused, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to walk away. Another part saw the broken woman beneath the arrogance. You didn't lose everything, I said after a moment. You lost what you built on pride. Her eyes glistened. You really hate me, don't you? I shook my head. No, I just wish you'd listened. For a long moment we stood there in silence, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the ruins of Maple Creek. Then I turned and walked home. The county report came out a month later. The findings were brutal. Primary cause: unpermitted modification of a designated stormwater drainage corridor. Responsible party: Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Complaint origin: Kenneth Baker. The story hit local news. Headlines read: Engineers warning ignored HOA project causes $4 million flood disaster. The footage showed aerial drone shots of Maple Creek's drowned streets, the cracked roads, the toppled fences. And right in the middle, my old footage of the meetings where Riley called me paranoid, where the crowd laughed. It went viral. For a brief moment, I became the neighborhood's cautionary tale and its reluctant hero. But I didn't want fame. I just wanted peace. When I finally walked along the newly rebuilt creek months later, the air was fresh again. The county had restored the drainage to its natural form, deeper, stronger, cleaner. The sound of flowing water filled the quiet morning. It was beautiful. And this time, nobody was trying to cover it up with gravel. It took nearly 6 weeks for Maple Creek Estates to dry out completely. By the time the last of the floodwater receded, the manicured lawns were dead, the white fences warped, and the illusion of perfect suburbia was gone forever. What replaced it was anger, raw, heavy, and looking for a target. The HOA, once so proud of its authority, now stood stripped bare. Residents demanded accountability, insurance adjusters demanded answers, and county officials demanded money. There was no hiding anymore. The entire disaster was documented, photographed, and televised. And at the center of it all was Riley Thompson, the woman who used to believe she could control everything. The emergency HOA meeting that week was held in what used to be the community clubhouse, now half-gutted, the carpet still damp, and the air thick with mildew. A dozen residents crowded the folding chairs, their faces tense. The rest joined via video call because their homes were still uninhabitable. I didn't want to attend, but after everything that happened, I felt I owed it to the people who'd suffered because of her decisions. Daniel Lee, the acting president, called the meeting to order. This session is to address restitution fines and leadership restructuring. Let's keep it civil, he said, though everyone knew civil wasn't going to happen. Riley sat at the front, pale and withdrawn. Her usual confidence, the lipstick, the crisp posture, the controlling tone was gone. Her hands shook as she shuffled papers. A man from the county's Department of Environmental Management stood beside a stack of binders. After reviewing evidence, he said it's clear that the HOA violated several county ordinances. The modifications to the drainage system caused large-scale flooding, property loss, and environmental damage. As such, the HOA is liable for $175, 0 inches fines, and required to restore the area to original condition within 6 months. Gasps filled the room. Someone muttered, "We can't pay that." The official continued. Additionally, a civil suit may be filed if affected homeowners pursue damages. Riley's voice cracked. I didn't mean for this to happen. We were trying to improve the community. Karen Morales, the same woman who'd shouted at her before, stood up again. You lied to us, Riley. You said you had approval. You called Kenneth an idiot for warning you. Riley's face twisted. I thought he was exaggerating. How was I supposed to know? I finally spoke up, my voice steady. You were supposed to listen. That's all you ever had to do. The room fell quiet. Everyone turned toward me. I stood taking a deep breath. When I moved here, I wanted what you all wanted: peace, community, safety. I gave you every warning I could. I showed you the data, the maps, the risks. But pride got in the way. You wanted beauty more than you wanted sense. And now nature's collected the debt. Daniel nodded solemnly. Well said, Mr. Baker. Over the next few weeks, the HOA began to collapse. Several board members resigned. The treasurer admitted that Riley had authorized payments from the maintenance fund without proper approval, $312,000 spent on aesthetic improvements. Insurance companies launched their own investigations. Property values plummeted. News stations kept circling like vultures, milking the story for every headline. Meanwhile, I received a letter from the county attorney thanking me for my cooperation. They even offered to hire me as a consultant for the restoration project, a full-time position with hazard pay. I accepted. It was poetic in a way. The same man they laughed at was now getting paid to fix the problem they caused. The first step was removing what was left of Riley's trail. Crews tore up the gravel, dug out the clogged culverts, and recut the original watercourse. When the excavators began digging, the soil was still thick with silt and debris, but beneath it the old creek revealed itself. The same shape, the same slope, the same rhythm nature had carved long before anyone had ever drawn HOA boundaries. One morning while I was overseeing the excavation, Riley appeared again. She was thinner now, her hair tied back, her eyes tired and red. "I thought you moved out," I said without looking up from the survey map. "I'm selling," she murmured. "But I wanted to see it before I go." I nodded. "Seeing your mistakes up close helps them sink in." She flinched slightly. "I deserve that." For a long moment we just stood there, the sound of machinery filling the silence. Then she spoke softly. "They're suing me personally, you know. The HOA. Rick left last week. I don't even blame him." I finally looked at her. "You built your house on the wrong kind of foundation, Riley, not the ground. The pride." She wiped her eyes. "I just wanted to make the neighborhood better. And instead I said quietly, 'You made it honest.'" She frowned, not understanding. I gestured around us. "Look at it. No fake perfection left. Just real ground, real water, real consequences. It's ugly, but it's real. Maybe that's better than the lie you were selling." For the first time, she didn't argue. She just nodded and walked away, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. By winter, the restoration project was complete. The creek flowed again, narrow, steady, alive. The county installed new storm grates, retaining walls and warning signs about altering natural waterways. Neighbors began returning one by one, rebuilding what they could. A few families moved out entirely, selling at a loss. The rest stayed, perhaps humbled by what had happened. One evening, Jared invited me to a small neighborhood gathering, a quiet one, no speeches, no fanfare. Just a few people on the newly built wooden bridge over the creek holding cups of cocoa and watching the sunset. As the orange light reflected off the water, Jared said, "Hard to believe this little stream took down an entire HOA." I smiled faintly. Water doesn't destroy. It just reminds people what direction gravity goes. Everyone chuckled softly, though. The mood stayed reflective. Karen looked over. "You ever think about running the HOA yourself, Ken?" I laughed. "After what I've seen? No thanks. I'd rather stick to drainage than drama." But she smiled. "We could use someone who actually knows what they're talking about." "Maybe," I said, "but knowledge only helps if people are willing to listen." 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail, thick, official, sealed with a court emblem. Inside was a check, $42,000. Payment for my consulting work, plus an additional compensation bonus for preventive cooperation and documentation contribution. In other words, they were paying me for being right. I stared at the check for a long moment, then set it aside. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. Outside, I could hear the creek running, a sound both peaceful and powerful. A reminder that nature doesn't care about ego committees or titles. It only cares about balance. And for the first time in months, Maple Creek finally had balance again. The last time I saw Riley was at a county court hearing in early spring. She looked worn but composed, standing quietly beside her attorney as the judge finalized the fines and dissolution of her HOA position. When she saw me in the hallway afterward, she hesitated, then approached. "Kenneth," she said softly, "thank you for helping with the cleanup." I nodded. "Wasn't about you. It was about fixing what was broken." She smiled weakly. "You fixed more than that." Maybe she was right. Maybe the flood had washed away more than debris. Maybe it had washed away the arrogance that had poisoned this place. As I stepped outside the courthouse, the first drops of spring rain began to fall. I tilted my head up and let them hit my face, not with fear but with quiet satisfaction. This time the water had somewhere to go. Spring came early that year. The grass returned, wildflowers began to sprout along the newly rebuilt creek, and the air in Maple Creek Estates smelled clean again the way it used to before the HOA's obsession with control turned everything sterile. I walked the path, one quiet morning, boots pressing into the damp soil. The sound of water rushing softly over the rocks filled the air steady alive like nature itself was breathing again. For months I had avoided calling it the creek. It felt wrong after what had happened, as if naming it brought back memories of everything that was lost. But that morning, as sunlight sparkled off the surface, I realized something. It wasn't just a creek. It was proof. Proof that no matter how much people try to bend nature to their will, the earth always finds a way to correct them. The county project had officially ended, and I'd finished my role as consulting engineer. The job had brought me closure and a sense of vindication I didn't expect to feel so quietly. There were no parades, no applause, just stability, balance. Maple Creek Estates was no longer the picture-perfect neighborhood that once bragged about symmetry and status. Now it was something better, imperfect, scarred, but wiser. Several houses still bore water stains, silent reminders of the flood. Some residents left and never came back. But those who stayed had changed. They planted native grasses instead of imported ones. They cleaned their own drains. They waved to each other without judgment. And for the first time, HOA meetings were about fixing problems instead of flexing power. I didn't attend those meetings anymore. I didn't need to. The people who once mocked me were now quoting my old warnings like gospel. Daniel, the new HOA president, even invited me to a community open house to discuss disaster prevention. He introduced me as the man who saw what none of us could. I stood before the small crowd, most of them my neighbors, some still rebuilding, some still embarrassed, and said I didn't see anything special. I just paid attention. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. I continued. The truth is, simple nature isn't our enemy. It's not chaos to be tamed. It's a system one that was here long before we were, and it doesn't answer to votes, opinions, or HOA committees. You can't outvote gravity. People chuckled softly, but they listened. Then I said something I hadn't planned to. We build walls because we're afraid of losing control. But control is the illusion that causes the most damage. When you bury a creek, you bury common sense. That line got quiet applause, not loud or theatrical, but genuine. Afterward, several people approached me to thank me. One elderly man, a retired teacher, shook my hand and said, "You know, you might have saved more than just our homes. You might have saved our perspective." Later that evening, I stopped by the restored creek again. The county had added a small wooden bridge to replace the one that was destroyed. It wasn't fancy, just solid, functional, natural wood that blended into the landscape. Someone had placed a new plaque on it this time, without the pompous HOA branding. It simply read, "Maple Creek, let it flow." I smiled when I saw it, not because it praised anyone, but because it told the truth. The sun dipped low behind the trees, painting everything gold. A pair of kids ran across the bridge, laughing, their boots splashing in the shallows. Their mother called after them, "Stay near the edge." The kids didn't care. They were free running, splashing, playing in something that was once forbidden. The sound of their laughter mixed with the steady murmur of water, and for the first time since the flood, I felt peace settle over this place. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the county or the HOA. It was handwritten, addressed in neat cursive. "Dear Mr. Baker, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did, not just for the community, but for me. I've moved out of Maple Creek, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I've learned more in the last 6 months than I did in 50 years of managing people. I see now how blind I was, how pride can drown, reason faster than any flood. You were right, and I was cruel for mocking that. I'm sorry. Riley Thompson." I read it twice. No one else needed to see it. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into my desk drawer right beside the folder labeled HOA Drainage Proof. That chapter was closed. Summer arrived and Maple Creek began to heal in earnest. The once soggy lots turned green again. The homeowners who stayed learned to laugh about things, even the storm. People joked about Riley's River whenever it rained too hard. But behind the humor, there was a new kind of respect for the land, for expertise, and for each other. I became unintentionally the go-to guy for practical questions. If a drain clogged or someone wanted to install new landscaping, they came to me first. I didn't mind. Helping them felt good, not for pride, but because they finally listened. Even the county sent me to speak at a public safety seminar. Standing behind the podium, I looked at the audience, city planners, engineers, and citizens, and said, "Floods don't start with storms. They start with decisions." One day, months later, after a light rain, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the runoff move down the creek. The sun broke through the clouds, scattering light over the water's surface, like 1,000 tiny mirrors. It was beautiful, not in the artificial way the HOA once demanded, but in the raw, natural sense. The kind of beauty you can't buy, design, or decorate into existence. And it hit me then, this whole ordeal wasn't just about drainage or floods. It was about people, how easily we trade wisdom for pride, how we mistake control for progress, and how sometimes the most powerful lesson comes from what we fail to prevent. Weeks later, a young couple moved into one of the rebuilt homes. They had a toddler who liked to throw pebbles into the creek. One evening, the father approached me while I was checking my lawn. "Hey," he said, "you're Kenneth, right? The engineer guilty," I said with a small grin. He smiled. "Riley told us about you before she left. Said you're the reason this place even still exists." I blinked. "She told you that?" He nodded. "Yeah. Said you taught her a lesson she'll never forget." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Then I just smiled faintly and said, "She taught us all one." That night, I sat by the window as another gentle rain began to fall. Not a storm, not a flood, just rain. I watched it stream down the gutters, glide along the street, and pour neatly into the reopened channel that wound behind the houses. The sound was soft, rhythmic, alive. I whispered to myself, "Now that's the sound of wisdom." And as lightning flickered faintly in the far distance, I thought of how far we'd all come, from arrogance to humility, from ruin to renewal. Water had washed away the lies, the pride, the pretense. What it left behind wasn't just clean ground, it was clarity. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: never underestimate the quiet warnings in life, whether they come from nature experience or people who've walked the hard road before you. Pride makes us deaf, pain makes us listen. Riley learned that too late, but her mistake became everyone's lesson. So if someone ever tells you, "It's fine, nothing will happen," remember Maple Creek, remember the water that proved them wrong, and remember that truth doesn't yell, it flows, it waits. It always finds its way through. What about you? Have you ever tried to warn someone who refused to listen until it was too late? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of poetic justice, real consequences, and HOA drama that hits harder than the rain.